If they ever hear your voice, you won't belong to yourself anymore. The warning had never left Lydia Hale, not in 8 years, not in the quietest corners of her mind where even thoughts felt too loud. She stood near the back of the hall now, hands folded neatly in front of her, eyes lowered just enough to avoid attention, but not enough to invite suspicion. The air smelled faintly of pine and polished wood, the kind of place where power lingered long after footsteps faded. Around her, voices rose and fell, laughter, whispers, commands, but none of them belonged to her. They never did. To them, she was the mute Omega, the girl who couldn't speak, couldn't argue, couldn't refuse. A shadow that moved when told and disappeared when dismissed. 8 years of silence had carved her into something smaller, something safer. Or at least, that was what she told herself. Because silence was not weakness. Silence was survival. Her fingers tightened slightly against the fabric of her sleeve as a sharp voice cut through the noise. You. Come here. Lydia lifted her gaze just enough to see the beta gesturing impatiently. She moved immediately, steps quiet, controlled, every motion practiced until it looked effortless. That was the trick. Never hesitate, never draw attention, never give them a reason to look too closely. She stopped a few feet away, head tilted in polite acknowledgement. The beta exhaled through his nose, already irritated. Take these to the west corridor. And don't mess it up. He shoved a small stack of folded linens into her arms without waiting for a response. He never did. No one expected words from her. That expectation, no, that assumption, was her shield. Lydia nodded once, slow and obedient, before turning away. Her heart beat steady, measured, always measured. Because the moment it wasn't, the moment it raced or faltered, she risked everything. As she walked, the corridor stretched long and dim, lit by soft golden lamps spaced every few yards. Her footsteps made no sound against the polished floor. She had learned that too. How to exist without leaving traces. How to breathe quietly. How to swallow every instinct that begged her to speak. 8 years ago, she hadn't been silent. 8 years ago, her voice had been the one thing she couldn't control. Warm, clear, impossible to ignore. She remembered the way people had turned when she spoke, the way attention had followed her like a shadow she couldn't outrun. And then she remembered the night everything changed. The night an Omega cried out, and every alpha in the room had stilled. The way the air had shifted, heavy and charged with something she didn't understand but knew, instinctively, to fear. That was the night Lydia learned what a voice could cost. Her grip tightened slightly on the linens as the memory brushed too close, too sharp. She slowed her breathing, forcing it back into rhythm. Inhale. Exhale. Silence was control. Silence was invisibility. Silence was the only thing keeping her free. A faint sound echoed from somewhere ahead. A child's soft whimper, quickly hushed. Lydia's steps faltered for the briefest moment. Just a fraction. Enough for her chest to tighten. She knew that sound. Fear, small and fragile. Her throat burned instinctively, a reflex she hadn't been able to erase no matter how many years passed. For a split second, the urge rose. Say something, anything, just to comfort, just to help. Her lips parted. A breath caught. And then, nothing. She closed her mouth just as quickly, pressing her teeth together as if that alone could lock the sound away forever. The silence that followed felt heavier than before, like the air itself was watching her. Lydia forced her steps forward again, faster now, more deliberate. She didn't look toward the sound. She didn't slow again. She didn't speak. She never would. Because the moment her voice returned to the world would claim her in return. And somewhere deep inside, beneath years of practiced quiet, a single thought lingered. What if it already had? Lydia did not stop walking until the corridor curved out of sight and the sound behind her dissolved into silence. But the echo of it stayed, threading through her thoughts like a whisper she could not quite outrun, and she hated that more than anything, because it reminded her that no matter how disciplined she had become, there were still cracks in her control, small moments where instinct rose faster than reason, where the part of her that used to speak still remembered how. And that part was dangerous. That part could undo everything she had built over 8 careful years. So she slowed her breathing again, counting each inhale and exhale as she reached the west corridor and set the linens down exactly where they were meant to go, smoothing the edges with precise movements. making sure nothing about her presence lingered after. She stepped away, but as she turned, she felt it, something subtle but unmistakable, the shift in the air, like a current moving beneath the surface, and her shoulders stiffened just slightly before she forced them to relax. Because drawing attention was the one mistake she could not afford. Not today, not now, not when the pack felt different, heavier somehow, as if something had entered its borders without announcement, yet carried enough weight to change the atmosphere itself. And even without looking, she knew others felt it too. She could hear it in the lowered voices, in the way footsteps slowed, in the way conversations ended just a second too quickly, and Lydia kept her gaze forward as she moved back toward the main hall, but her senses sharpened despite herself, catching fragments of whispers as she passed. "He is here," someone murmured under their breath, barely audible, and another voice answered, tense and disbelieving. "Already? That is not possible," followed by a quiet, "They said he would not arrive until nightfall," and Lydia's fingers curled slightly at her sides before she stilled them, because she knew who they meant without needing the name spoken. There was only one presence that could ripple through a pack like this, only one figure whose arrival turned certainty into unease, the Alpha King, and the thought alone sent a cold awareness down her spine. Not fear exactly, but something sharper, something instinctive, like standing too close to the edge of something vast and unseen, and she lowered her head a fraction more as she stepped back into the hall, positioning herself along the wall where shadows softened her outline, because invisibility mattered more now than ever. If the king was here, everything changed, the rules, the attention, the risks, especially for someone like her, someone who had spent years ensuring she would never be noticed. But even as she told herself that, her body betrayed her in small ways, a heightened alertness, a tension coiled beneath her skin, as if some buried instinct recognized the shift before her mind fully accepted it. And then the doors at the far end of the hall opened, not with force, not with spectacle, but with a quiet authority that silenced the room more effectively than any command, and Lydia felt it before she saw him. The stillness that followed, the way every voice died mid-breath, the way even the air seemed to pause, and she did not look up. She could not yet, because looking meant acknowledging, and acknowledging meant risking too much, so she kept her gaze lowered, fixed on the polished floor just ahead of her feet. But she could feel movement, slow, deliberate. Footsteps crossing the hall, each one measured, unhurried, as if time itself adjusted to match his pace. And her heartbeat shifted despite her control, just slightly faster, just enough to remind her that no amount of silence could fully erase what she was. And then it happened, something so small it might have gone unnoticed by anyone else, but not by her. The footsteps paused, not at the center of the room, not near the pack leaders waiting to greet him, but somewhere closer, somewhere wrong. And Lydia's breath caught for the briefest moment before she forced it steady again. Do not react, do not move, do not give anything away. But the awareness pressed closer, heavier, like a presence standing just a few feet away, and though she kept her eyes down, she could feel it, not a touch, not even a sound, but attention, sharp and focused, as if something unseen had turned fully toward her. And for the first time in 8 years, silence did not feel like safety, it felt like exposure, and deep in her chest, beneath all her practiced control, a single, dangerous thought surfaced. What if hiding had never made her invisible at all? Lydia did not lift her eyes, not even when the silence stretched so long it felt deliberate, as if the entire hall waited for something unseen to happen, and yet she could feel it, that focused awareness still resting on her like a weight she could not shake, pressing against her carefully constructed stillness, testing it without a single word spoken, and she reminded herself again to breathe, slow and even, because fear had a sound, even when unspoken. It lived in the rhythm of the body, in the way lungs tightened or rushed, and she had spent years erasing those tells, sanding them down until nothing remained but quiet control. But this was different. This presence did not need sight to notice her. It did not rely on movement or sound the way others did. It felt deeper than that, like something instinctive reaching for something it did not yet understand. And the thought alone sent a flicker of unease through her chest before she buried it, forcing her shoulders to remain relaxed, her posture neutral, just another unnoticed omega at the edge of the room. Nothing more, nothing worth pausing for. And then the footsteps resumed, slow, measured, moving past her without a word, and the shift in pressure eased just enough for her lungs to expand fully again. But the relief did not come, because she knew, somehow, that it was not over, not truly, and the hall began to breathe again, voices returning cautiously, like people stepping onto uncertain ground after a tremor. And Lydia allowed herself one small inhale deeper than the rest before she moved, careful and unhurried, slipping along the wall toward the side exit where tasks waited and expectations remained simple. Because work was predictable, work required nothing from her except obedience, and obedience was easy when silence protected her. But as she stepped into the narrower corridor, the noise behind her dimming into a distant murmur, a different sound reached her, not loud, not urgent, but distinct enough to pull her attention despite her discipline, a quiet scuff against the floor, uneven, hesitant, and she turned her head slightly, just enough to see a young boy standing near the corner, small shoulders drawn inward, eyes wide with uncertainty as he clutched the edge of the wall, as if unsure whether he was allowed to move forward or retreat, and Lydia stilled for a moment, her gaze softening without meaning to, because she recognized that expression, that careful hesitation, the instinct to make oneself smaller in a space that did not feel safe. And her throat tightened again, that same dangerous reflex stirring beneath the surface. Say something. Just something simple, something kind. But she did not. She could not. Instead, she stepped closer. Slowly, lowering herself just enough to meet his eye level without crowding him, her movements deliberate and gentle, and the boy blinked at her, uncertainty flickering into cautious curiosity, and Lydia offered the smallest gesture she could allow, a slight tilt of her head, a softening of her expression, a silent reassurance that asked no questions and made no demands, and for a moment it worked. His shoulders easing just a fraction, his grip loosening on the wall, but then footsteps sounded. From farther down the corridor, heavier, more purposeful, and the boy's attention snapped away, fear returning just as quickly as it had faded, and Lydia felt the shift like a physical thing, the fragile calm breaking before it could settle, and without thinking, without allowing herself the time to stop it, she reached out, her hand brushing lightly against his sleeve in a fleeting attempt to steady him, and in that same instant, the sound slipped free, barely more than a breath shaped into. Meaning, soft, instinctive, it is okay. The words so quiet they might have been imagined, but they existed, they left her, and the moment they did, Lydia froze completely, every muscle locking as if stillness alone could undo what had just happened, her pulse roaring suddenly in her ears, too loud, too fast, and she withdrew her hand immediately, stepping back as if distance could erase the echo of her own voice. But the silence that followed was not empty. It was sharp, aware, listening, and the boy stared at her, confusion flickering across his face as if trying to understand what he had just heard, and Lydia's chest tightened painfully as realization settled in. Not just that she had spoken, but that she had done it without thinking, without control, and somewhere behind her, faint but unmistakable, another set of footsteps slowed, then stopped, and she did not need to turn to know that whatever had paused in that hall earlier had not moved on as completely as she had hoped. Because some silences did not hide things, they revealed them, and for the first time in 8 years, Lydia felt the fragile certainty she had built begin to fracture in a way she could not immediately repair. Lydia did not turn, not when the footsteps behind her came to a complete stop, not when the air seemed to tighten around that single, fragile moment where everything could unravel. Because turning would mean acknowledging, and acknowledging would mean confirming what she already feared, that she had been heard, truly heard, not dismissed as a stray sound or imagined breath, but recognized for what it was, and that was something she could not afford. So she stood perfectly still, her back straight, her gaze fixed somewhere just past the boy's shoulder as if nothing had happened at all, as if the silence she had broken had never existed. But her body betrayed her in ways she could not fully control, the faint tremor in her fingers, the subtle rise and fall of her chest that refused to settle into its usual rhythm, and she forced herself to correct it. Inhale slowly, exhale slower, steady, controlled, invisible, just like before, just like always, while the boy continued to stare at her, confusion lingering in his wide eyes, his lips parting slightly as if he might ask something, might repeat what he thought he heard, and Lydia's heart tightened sharply at the possibility. But before he could speak, a voice entered the space, calm, low, and unmistakably deliberate. "Go back to the hall," it said, directed at the boy, not unkind, but leaving no room for hesitation. And the child flinched slightly before nodding quickly, his attention shifting away from Lydia as he obeyed. Without question, his small footsteps retreating down the corridor until the sound faded completely, leaving only silence behind. And Lydia knew then that she was no longer alone, truly alone, because the presence she had felt earlier had followed, had remained, had waited, and slowly, carefully, she lowered her gaze further, not in submission, but in calculated restraint, because there were rules she understood without needing them spoken, and one of them was this: never meet the eyes of someone who could see more than you intended to show. And the quiet stretched again, longer this time, heavier, as if the moment itself was being examined, weighed, and then, closer now, just a few feet away. The voice spoke again, softer, almost thoughtful. "You should not be in this corridor." And Lydia remained still, offering no response, because that was the role she had built, the expectation she had reinforced for years, and breaking it now would only confirm what she was trying to deny. So she let the silence answer for her, the same silence that had protected her for so long. But it did not feel the same anymore. It felt thin, fragile, as if it could be seen through, and she sensed movement. A step closer, measured, unhurried, and the space between them seemed to narrow without him needing to rush, and her pulse reacted again, betraying her control in small, insistent beats that echoed too loudly in her own ears, and she hated that her body responded to him in ways she could not suppress, as if something instinctive recognized something dangerous and important at the same time. And then he stopped, close enough now that she could feel the subtle shift in temperature. The quiet presence of someone who did not need to assert dominance because it already existed in everything he did, and the silence stretched once more before he spoke again, quieter this time, almost as if the words were meant only for her. 8 years is a long time to hold your breath. And Lydia's heart stuttered, just once, but it was enough to send a sharp wave of awareness through her chest, because that was not a guess, not a careless observation. It was precise, intentional, and it struck too close to something she had never allowed anyone to see. And still she did not move, did not react outwardly, but inside, something shifted, something small but undeniable, because silence had always been her shield, her control, her choice, and now, for the first time, it felt like it had been seen through completely. And then the final words came, low and certain, carrying no force yet impossible to ignore. "You spoke." And Lydia felt the truth of it settle into the space between them, quiet but irreversible, as if the moment itself had been marked, and no matter how still she stood, no matter how carefully she controlled her breathing, nothing about her silence could erase what had already been heard. And for the first time in 8 years, Lydia understood that the danger was no longer in being noticed by everyone. It was in being noticed by the one person who did not need proof to know exactly what she was hiding. Lydia did not deny it, but she did not confirm it either, because there was nothing left to gain from words now, and everything to lose. So she held on to the only thing she had ever controlled, her stillness, her silence, even as it felt thinner than it ever had before, like glass stretched too far, ready to fracture under pressure she could not predict. And for a long moment neither of them moved, the space between them charged with something quiet but undeniable, not loud, not forceful, but certain, like a truth that had already settled whether it was acknowledged or not. And she could feel his attention in a way she had never experienced before, not wandering, not dismissive, but focused, deliberate, as if he was not just looking at her, but listening to everything she was trying not to reveal, the subtle shift of breath, the controlled rhythm she fought to maintain, the tension she hid beneath calm movements. And it unsettled her more than anything else, because silence had always been enough. It had always kept her safe. But this felt like standing in front of something that did not rely on sound to understand. And slowly, carefully, she lowered her head a fraction more, not in submission, but in calculation, because there, were rules she could still follow, ways to maintain distance without provoking attention, and she turned slightly as if to continue down the corridor, to return to her duties, to become once again what everyone believed she was: unnoticed, unimportant, untouchable. But she did not take a step before his voice came again, quieter now, but carrying a weight that made movement feel impossible. If you walk away, it will not change what I heard. And Lydia stopped, not because she wanted to, but because the truth of it settled too heavily to ignore, and her fingers curled slightly at her sides before she forced them still, her mind searching for the safest path forward, the one that did not expose more than it already had. But every option felt narrower now, more fragile, because he had already crossed the boundary she had spent years protecting. And then, unexpectedly, his tone shifted, not softer exactly, but less pointed, as if he had stepped back from the edge of something without fully leaving it. "Why hide it?" he asked, not demanding, not accusing, just asking. And the question lingered between them in a way that felt more dangerous than any command could have been, because it required something she could not give, not without unraveling everything. And for a brief moment, a dangerous thought flickered through her mind. What if she simply remained silent? What if she let him assume, let him question without ever answering? But the thought faltered as quickly as it came, because this was not someone who would be satisfied with assumptions, not someone who would leave a question unanswered if it mattered. And she felt that instinctively, the same way she had felt his presence before she ever saw him. And so she did the only thing she could. She maintained the role she had built. She remained still, quiet, unreadable, letting the silence stretch again, hoping it would be enough, hoping it would still hold. And for a moment, it did. The corridor remained quiet, the tension unbroken, until he exhaled slowly, almost thoughtful, and stepped back just enough that the pressure shifted, not gone, but altered, less immediate, more distant, and Lydia felt it. Instantly, the subtle release allowing her lungs to expand fully again, though the unease remained, because distance did not mean safety, not anymore. And then he spoke once more, the words measured, deliberate, carrying no force yet impossible to ignore. "You have been careful," he said, and there was something in the tone that made her chest tighten unexpectedly. Not judgment, not mockery, but recognition, as if he understood something she had never explained. And that unsettled her more than anything else, because understanding meant seeing, and being seen was the one thing she had avoided for 8 years. And then came the final shift, subtle but undeniable, the quiet change in his voice that marked something new, something she could not yet name. But careful is not the same as invisible, and Lydia felt the weight of those words settle into her chest, not sharp, not immediate, but deep, like something that would linger long after the moment passed. And for the first time since she had chosen silence, she realized that it might not be enough anymore, not against someone who had already begun to see through it. And as he turned away, his footsteps retreating down the corridor with the same measured calm he had entered with, Lydia remained where she was, unmoving, her breath slow but no longer steady, because something had shifted in a way she could not undo, something quiet but irreversible. And though no one else had heard her, though no one else had noticed, it did not matter, because the one person who did was the only one who needed to. And deep in her chest, beneath years of control and silence, a single truth settled with unsettling clarity: she was no longer hidden. Lydia did not move for several seconds after the footsteps faded completely, as if her body needed time to understand that the space around her was no longer occupied. But the absence did not bring relief. It only made the silence louder, heavier, filled with the echo of everything that had just happened. And slowly, carefully, she forced herself to inhale, to steady the rhythm that had slipped beyond her control. But it did not settle the way it used to, did not return to that practiced quiet she relied on, because something fundamental had shifted, something she could not simply reset with discipline alone. And she hated that. Hated the unfamiliar uncertainty threading through her thoughts. Because uncertainty meant risk, and risk was exactly what she had avoided for 8 years. And yet here it was, standing in the aftermath of a single moment she had not been able to stop, a single breath that had turned into sound, and she pressed her lips together, firmly, as if that alone could restore the boundary she had broken. but it felt different now, not like protection, more like a fragile habit that no longer held the same certainty, and that realization unsettled her more than his words had, because his presence had been external, something she could step away from. But this was internal, something she carried with her whether she wanted to or not, and she forced herself to move. Finally, stepping forward down the corridor with measured control, returning to the path she had intended before everything shifted, because routine was still something she could hold on to, something predictable, and she needed that now more than ever. But as she walked, the memory of his voice followed, not loud, not intrusive, but precise, each word settling into place with uncomfortable clarity. "You spoke." The simplicity of it made it impossible to deny, impossible to reframe, and she exhaled slowly through her nose, trying to push the thought aside, to focus on what came next instead of what had already happened, because dwelling on it would not change anything, and change was what she needed to avoid. But the more she tried to dismiss it, the more another realization pressed forward, quieter but far more unsettling. He had not exposed her, he had not called others, had not raised his voice or drawn attention to what he had discovered, and that choice, that restraint, did not feel like mercy. It felt intentional, deliberate in a way she did not yet understand, and Lydia slowed her steps slightly as the corridor opened back toward the main hall, the distant hum of voices returning, grounding her in the present. But her thoughts remained caught on that single point. Why had he said nothing beyond that moment? Why had he allowed her to remain what she appeared to be, at least for now? And the question lingered without answer, creating a different kind of tension, one that stretched forward instead of pressing down, something unresolved that would not simply disappear, and she felt it in the way her body remained alert, her senses sharper than before, as if anticipating something she could not yet see. And when she stepped back into the hall, she did not look toward the center, did not search for him, but she felt the difference immediately, the awareness that he was still there, somewhere within the space. Moving or standing, it did not matter, his presence carried regardless. And Lydia adjusted her posture instinctively, her movements returning to the careful neutrality she had perfected, blending back into the rhythm of the room as if nothing had changed, as if she had always been exactly this, quiet, unseen, untouched, and yet beneath that practiced exterior, something new remained, a subtle awareness that followed her like a shadow she could not fully escape, because invisibility had always been her choice, her control, and now it felt less certain, less absolute, as if it depended on more than just her own silence. And that thought unsettled her in a way she could not ignore, because it meant her safety was no longer entirely in her own hands. And as she moved to take on another task, responding to a gesture from across the room without hesitation, her focus sharp and precise, she carried that realization with her, quiet but persistent, because something had begun, something she could not undo, and though no one else in the hall seemed to notice her, seemed to care, she knew with a certainty that settled deep in her chest that somewhere within that same space, someone did, and that knowledge changed everything in ways she had only just begun to understand. Lydia moved through the hall as she always had, quiet, efficient, invisible in the way she had perfected over years of practice, her hands steady as she carried trays, adjusted linens, responded to silent gestures without hesitation, but beneath the surface, nothing felt the same, because awareness followed her now, not constant, not overwhelming, but present enough that she could not ignore it, like a thread pulled tight between her and something she could not see. And every time she tried to lose herself in routine, to disappear into the rhythm of tasks and expectations, that thread remained, subtle but unbroken, and she knew, without needing to look, that he was still somewhere within the room, that the distance between them did not erase what had already been recognized, and she focused harder on her movements, on the placement of every object, the angle of every step, the timing of every breath, because control was the only thing she had left to rely on. And she refused to let that slip further, not after everything she had already risked. But the hall felt different now, not because of the crowd or the voices or the shifting attention of those gathered, but because of the weight beneath it all, the quiet understanding that something had changed in a way no one else could see. And as she passed near a group of higher-ranked wolves, their conversation drifting around her without acknowledgement. She caught fragments of words: inspection, territory alignment, temporary stay, and each phrase added another layer to the tension building in her chest. Because if he was staying, even briefly, then this was not a moment she could simply endure and outlast. It was something that would continue, something that would unfold over time, and that made the situation far more dangerous than she had first believed, and Lydia adjusted her path slightly, keeping to the edges of the room where shadows softened her presence, where fewer eyes lingered. But even there, the sense of being observed did not fully fade. It shifted instead, quieter, more controlled, as if attention no longer needed to be constant to remain effective. And she hated how aware she had become of it, how her instincts kept searching for it even when she told herself not to, because that awareness alone was a form of vulnerability, a crack in the composure she had maintained for so long. And as she reached for a glass placed too close to the edge of a table, her fingers paused for just a fraction of a second, the movement so small no one else would notice, but she did, and she corrected it immediately, steadying her hand before continuing as if nothing had happened. But inside, the tension tightened further, because hesitation was not something she allowed, not something she could afford, and yet it had happened, subtle but real, and she knew exactly why, because her focus was no longer entirely her own. It was divided, split between the task in front of her and the awareness lingering just beyond it, and that division made everything feel sharper, more fragile. And then, without warning, the room shifted again, not with noise or movement, but with silence. The kind that fell too quickly to be natural, and Lydia felt it instantly, her body responding before her mind could fully process it, her posture straightening just slightly, her breath catching before she forced it steady again. And she did not look, not at first, because she already knew. The awareness that had followed her all this time had moved closer again, not abruptly, not forcefully, but with the same deliberate calm that made it impossible to ignore. And when she finally allowed herself to glance up just enough to confirm it, her gaze remained low, careful, never meeting his directly, but it was enough to see the shift in the room around him, the space that naturally formed, the way others adjusted without being told. And she lowered her eyes again immediately, returning to her task, because acknowledging more than that would only draw attention she could not afford. But the proximity changed everything. The air felt different, heavier, charged in a way that made her pulse react despite her efforts to control it. And she focused on the glass in her hand, on the simple action of placing it back into alignment, grounding herself in something tangible, something she could control. But even as she did, she felt it again, that precise, focused awareness settling on her, not searching, not uncertain, but deliberate, as if he had already found what he was looking for and was now simply observing. And the realization sent a quiet but undeniable ripple through her chest, because this was no longer a moment she could avoid, no longer something she could step away from. It was moving toward her, steadily, inevitably, and for the first time since she had chosen silence. Lydia understood that what came next would not be something she could fully control, no matter how carefully she tried. The moment stretched longer than it should have, longer than any simple task or passing glance could justify, and Lydia felt it settle into her awareness with quiet certainty. This was no longer observation from a distance. This was attention directed with purpose, and every instinct she had refined over the years urged her to withdraw, to step back, to dissolve into the edges of the room where she belonged. But her body did not move, not immediately, because moving now, too suddenly, too deliberately, could draw the very focus she was trying to avoid. So she remained where she was, her fingers resting lightly against the edge of the table, as if finishing a task that no longer required her attention, her posture controlled, her breathing measured, even as her pulse pressed harder against the inside of her ribs. And she told herself again, do not react, do not give anything away, because reaction was recognition, and recognition was exposure. But the silence around her shifted again, not empty, not passive, but shaped, as if something unseen had narrowed its focus entirely. And then came the sound, not loud, not commanding, but unmistakably directed, leave us. And the words did not belong to her, did not touch her directly, but the effect was immediate. The low murmur of voices nearby stilled, footsteps redirected, the subtle rearranging of space. That followed quiet authority without question, and Lydia felt the shift ripple outward, the way people moved away, creating distance without needing explanation, and she remained still, even as the space around her grew quieter, more isolated, because she understood what that meant without needing confirmation, and the realization settled into her chest with a weight she could not ignore. This was no longer something she could blend out of, and slowly, carefully, she withdrew her hand from the table, lowering it to her side as she turned just slightly, enough to acknowledge presence without meeting it, enough to follow the rules she had always obeyed, and the silence between them felt different now, more defined, as if it had boundaries, as if it belonged to the space created specifically for this moment. And she could feel him closer, not just in distance, but in awareness, like standing near something that did not need to move to be felt, and her breath threatened to shift again, to betray the control she fought to maintain, but she steadied it, forcing each inhale to remain slow, each exhale quieter than the last, because control was still hers, even now. It had to be, and then his voice came again, softer than before, but clearer in the quiet space. "You are very practiced," and Lydia did not respond, could not respond, but the words settled over her with unsettling precision, not mocking, not dismissive, but observant, as if he had been watching longer than she realized, and she held on to her stillness, her silence, even as the meaning behind his tone pressed closer, and he stepped nearer, not abruptly, not forcefully, but with that same deliberate calm that made every movement feel intentional. And the distance between them narrowed until she could feel it fully, the quiet presence that seemed to fill the space without effort. And then he stopped, close enough that even without looking, she knew exactly where he stood, and the silence stretched again, heavier now, expectant, and for a moment, she thought he might speak again, might press further, might demand something she could not give, but instead, the quiet lingered, and then, almost imperceptibly, he shifted, not away, but slightly to the side, as if adjusting his position to better observe, to better understand, and Lydia felt the weight of that attention settle again, not fleeting, not uncertain, but focused in a way that made her composure feel fragile despite all her effort. And then, finally, the words came, low and steady, carrying no urgency yet impossible to ignore. "Look at me." And the request was simple, almost quiet, but it carried more weight than any command, because it asked for something she had spent years avoiding, direct acknowledgement, and Lydia's fingers tightened slightly at her sides before she stilled them, her breath catching just once before she forced it steady again. Because this was the moment, the one she had tried to avoid, the one she had hoped would never come, and for a brief second, a dangerous instinct rose within her, to obey without thought, to follow the request simply because it had been given, but she stopped it, holding on to the last thread of control she had, because looking meant being seen, truly seen, and that was something she could not undo once it happened. And yet the silence that followed did not allow escape. It did not fade or shift. It remained, waiting, patient in a way that made refusal feel less like protection and more like delay, and Lydia realized then, with quiet certainty, that this moment was not something she could step around, not something she could outlast. It was something she would have to face, and slowly, carefully, with a control that felt thinner than ever before, she lifted her gaze just enough to meet the space where he stood, and in that small, deliberate movement, everything changed. For a fraction of a second, nothing existed except that single, deliberate movement, Lydia lifting her gaze just enough to meet his, and the world seemed to narrow around it, the distant sounds of the hall fading into something indistinct, unimportant, because this was different from anything she had allowed in 8 years. This was direct, undeniable, and the moment her eyes found his, she understood why she had avoided it for so long. Because being seen like this was not the same as being noticed by others. This was something deeper, something that did not skim the surface but settled beneath it, and his gaze did not shift when she met it, did not waver or question. It held steady, calm, as if this was exactly what he had been waiting for, not surprised, not uncertain, but certain in a way that made her chest tighten unexpectedly, and Lydia felt it instantly, the loss of distance. The loss of control she had maintained so carefully, because silence could hide her voice, but it could not hide everything, not from this. And she forced herself to hold the eye contact for a heartbeat longer than instinct allowed before lowering her gaze again. Not abruptly, not in retreat, but in controlled withdrawal, because even that small connection had already done more than she intended, and her breath threatened to falter again. But she steadied it, drawing it back into rhythm with effort she had not needed before, and the silence that followed felt different now, no longer protective, no longer hers. It belonged to the space between them, shared, acknowledged, and then his voice came again, quieter than before, almost reflective. "There it is," he said, and Lydia's fingers tightened slightly at her sides before she stilled them, because the words were not loud, not demanding, but they carried recognition, not of something new, but of something confirmed, and that was far more dangerous, and she kept her gaze lowered, returning to the role she had built, because it was the only thing she could still hold on to, even if it felt fragile now. And for a moment, neither of them moved, the silence stretching once more. But this time it did not feel uncertain, it felt settled, as if something had shifted into place, something that would not move back no matter how still she remained. And then he stepped slightly closer, not enough to invade, not enough to force reaction, but enough to remind her of the distance that no longer existed. And Lydia felt the change in the air, subtle but undeniable, her awareness sharpening despite her attempts to remain neutral. And then came the question, low, deliberate, impossible to ignore. Was it fear, he asked, or choice? And the simplicity of it struck deeper than anything else he had said, because it cut through everything she had built, everything she had hidden behind, and placed it into something clear, something she could not easily dismiss. And for a moment, something inside her shifted, a flicker of something she had buried long ago. Not just fear, not just survival, but something else, something closer to defiance, to decision. Because silence had not only been forced on her, it had also been chosen, shaped, held on to even when she could have let it go. And the realization pressed against her chest in a way that felt unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable, and her lips parted just slightly before she could stop herself. Not enough for sound, not enough to break the silence again, but enough to remind her how thin the line had become, and she closed them again immediately, forcing control back into place. But it was different now, harder, less certain, and he watched her through it, not interrupting, not pushing, but not looking away either. And Lydia understood then that this was not a moment he intended to rush, not something he would force into an answer, because he did not need to. The question itself was enough, and it lingered between them, shaping the silence in a way that made it impossible to return to what it had been before. And for the first time since she had chosen silence, Lydia felt something else rising alongside her control, something she could not easily name, something that did not belong to fear alone. And that realization unsettled her more than anything else had so far, because it meant the boundaries she had relied on were no longer fixed. And as she stood there, still and quiet, her gaze lowered once more, she understood with quiet certainty that the silence she had used to protect herself was no longer just a shield. It had become something he could read, something he could question, and that meant she was no longer the only one shaping it. The question did not fade after he asked it. It did not dissolve into the background like everything else Lydia had learned to ignore. It remained, steady and unyielding, as if it had found a place within her that could not simply be dismissed, and she felt it there, pressing quietly against the control she had relied on for so long. Because fear had always been easy to understand, easy to justify. It had been the reason she stopped speaking, the reason she learned to disappear, the reason she shaped herself into something small enough to survive. But choice, that was different. That suggested something else, something she had not allowed herself to consider. And her breath caught for a fraction of a second before she forced it steady again, because she could not afford to linger on that thought. Not here, not now, not with his attention fixed so precisely on her. And she kept her gaze lowered, her posture still, but inside, something shifted in a way she could not fully control, because the question had not only been heard, it had been understood, and that made it dangerous in a way silence alone could not protect her from. And the quiet between them stretched again, not empty, not uncertain, but waiting, and Lydia knew he was not expecting a spoken answer, not yet, not in the way others might demand. Because this was not about forcing sound from her. It was about understanding what existed beneath it, and that realization unsettled her more than anything else, because it meant he was not looking for what she had hidden. He was looking for why she had hidden it, and she did not know how to shield that in the same way, did not know how to contain something that was not simply absence but intention, and her fingers tightened slightly at her sides before she stilled them, grounding herself in the only thing she could still control, her silence, her stillness, her refusal to give more than she already had. But even that felt different now, less like protection, more like something being examined, and she sensed it in the way his presence did not shift, did not press forward, but did not retreat either, as if he was allowing the moment to unfold on its own terms, confident that it would reveal what he needed without force, and the certainty of that unsettled her in a way she could not ignore, because it suggested patience. And patience meant this would not end here, would not fade. Once she stepped away, and then, quietly, almost as if speaking more to the moment than to her directly, he said, "You have been listening this entire time." And Lydia's chest tightened again, not from fear, not entirely, but from recognition, because he was right. She had been listening, not just now, but always, measuring every word spoken around her, learning what to avoid, what to hide, what to never become. And that awareness had shaped her silence just as much as fear had, and for a brief moment, something rose within her again. That same flicker she had felt before, something that did not belong to fear alone, something closer to resistance, to the quiet understanding that her silence had not only been taken from her, it had been chosen, refined, held on to even when she might have let it go. And her lips parted just slightly again before she caught herself, closing them firmly as she forced control back into place. But the moment had already shifted, even if no sound followed, because he saw it. She knew he did, in the way his gaze remained steady, in the way the silence between them did not return to what it had been before. And then he moved, not away, not yet, but slightly, just enough to break the stillness without fully leaving it. And when he spoke again, his voice was quieter than before, but carried something new, something that felt less like observation and more like decision. "Then you know what happens next." And Lydia felt the weight of those words settle into her chest, not sharp, not immediate, but certain, because they implied continuation, not conclusion. And that meant this was no longer a single moment she could contain. It was something that would follow her beyond this space, beyond this silence. And for the first time since she had chosen to stop speaking, Lydia understood that what she had built was no longer entirely hers to control, because someone else had stepped into it, someone who did not need her voice to understand her. And that changed everything in a way she could not undo, no matter how carefully she tried. The words did not demand an answer, but they changed the shape of the silence in a way Lydia could not ignore. Because what happens next was no longer something distant or abstract. It was immediate, present, unfolding whether she chose to engage with it or not. And she felt it in the way her breath refused to fully settle, in the way her awareness stayed sharpened even as she stood perfectly still, because standing still no longer meant being untouched. And that realization pressed deeper than anything else had so far. And she held on to her composure with deliberate control, her gaze lowered once more, her posture neutral, as if she could still return to what she had been before this moment began. But the thought felt fragile now, uncertain in a way she had never allowed before, and she sensed it, not just in herself, but in him, the subtle shift that followed his words, not movement, not distance, but intention, as if something had already been decided. And the silence stretched again. But this time it did not feel like waiting. It felt like transition, and Lydia understood then, with quiet clarity, that this was no longer about discovery, it was about direction. And that meant whatever came next would not be something she could simply avoid. And her fingers curled slightly at her sides before she forced them still, grounding herself in the only thing she could still claim as her own, her control, her silence, her ability to choose what she did next, even if the space around her had changed. And then he moved, not closer, not further, but past her, his presence shifting in a way that broke the stillness without breaking the connection entirely. And she felt it as he stepped just beyond her. The awareness no longer directly in front of her, but not gone either, repositioned in a way that altered the dynamic without releasing it. And then his voice came again, not directed as a question this time, but as something else, something more certain. "Walk," he said, and the simplicity of the word carried more weight than anything else, because it was not a request, not a suggestion, but it was not forceful either. It was expectation, quiet and steady, and Lydia felt the instinct to remain where she was rise immediately. The urge to resist, to hold on to the last piece of control she had, but it faltered almost as quickly as it came, because resisting here would not restore what had been lost. It would only change the way it unfolded, and that realization settled into her chest with uncomfortable clarity. And so, after a brief pause that lasted no longer than a breath, she moved, stepping forward with the same measured control she had always used, her pace steady, her posture unchanged, as if this were nothing more than another task, another instruction to follow. But the difference was undeniable, because this was not the same as obedience given to anyone else. This carried a different weight, a different awareness, and she felt it in the way the space around them shifted as she walked, the subtle parting of others who did not question, who did not interfere, as if the path ahead had already been cleared without needing explanation. And Lydia kept her gaze forward, not looking at him, not seeking confirmation, but aware of him nonetheless, the quiet presence just behind and slightly to the side, close enough to be felt, distant enough to allow movement. And the hall seemed quieter now. Or perhaps it was her focus narrowing, filtering everything else out as she followed the direction given, because each step felt deliberate, each moment more defined than the last, and she realized, slowly, that this was no longer about being unnoticed. It was about being led, not forcibly, not openly, but undeniably. And that realization carried a weight she could not ignore, because it meant her silence was no longer guiding her path alone. Something else had entered into it, something that understood it, something that could move within it without breaking it. And as she continued forward, her breathing steady but no longer entirely her own to control, Lydia understood with quiet certainty that whatever came next would not ask for her voice. It would not demand that she speak, because it did not need to. And that made it far more dangerous than anything she had faced before, because for the first time in 8 years, her silence was no longer enough to keep her free. The path through the hall felt longer than it should have, each step measured, each breath controlled, and yet nothing about it felt routine anymore, because Lydia was no longer moving within the boundaries she had set for herself. She was moving within something else, something shaped by his presence just behind her, not touching, not forcing, but guiding in a way that made every step feel intentional, and she could feel it in the subtle shifts around them, the way others moved aside without hesitation, the way conversations softened or stopped entirely as they passed, not out of fear, but recognition. And Lydia kept her gaze forward, her posture steady, refusing to let her awareness drift too far from the control she still held, because that control was all she had left that belonged entirely to her, and she would not let it slip, not even now. But the further they moved, the more she realized that this was not a direction chosen at random, the corridor ahead narrowing slightly, the noise of the main hall fading behind them until it became nothing more than a distant murmur, and the quiet that replaced it felt different, more contained, more deliberate, as if this space existed outside the rhythm of everything else. And Lydia felt her pulse shift again, not faster, but heavier, more present, because there was no longer anything to distract from it. No movement, no voices, just the sound of her own breathing and the steady, unhurried steps behind her. And she knew, without needing confirmation, that this was the point where things would change again, not abruptly, not dramatically, but in a way that would settle deeper than anything before it. And when she reached the end of the corridor, she slowed, just slightly, not enough to stop, but enough to acknowledge that there was nowhere else to go, and the door ahead stood closed, simple, unremarkable, but the space around it felt different, quieter than it should have been. And Lydia paused for the briefest moment before her hand moved, resting lightly against the handle, not turning it yet, because something in the stillness behind her shifted again, not movement, not distance, but attention, sharper now, more focused. And she felt it settle between her shoulders like a weight she could not ignore. And then his voice came, low, steady, close enough that she could feel the words rather than just hear them. "You can keep pretending out there," he said, and Lydia's fingers tightened slightly around the handle before she forced them still, because the words were not harsh, not accusing, but they carried something deeper, something that pressed against the illusion she had maintained for so long. And she did not turn, did not respond. But the silence that followed felt different now. Not protective, not neutral, but exposed, as if it no longer concealed what she had hidden. And then he stepped closer, just enough that the space between them narrowed completely, not touching, not crossing the final boundary, but close enough that there was no distance left to hide within. And Lydia felt her breath falter for a fraction of a second before she forced it steady again, her control thinner now than it had ever been, but still intact, still hers. And then he spoke again, quieter this time, but carrying more weight than before. "Not here." And the simplicity of it settled into her chest with a clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. Because this was not about exposure to others, not about revealing her secret to the pack. It was something else entirely, something contained within this moment, within this space. And Lydia realized then, with quiet certainty, that he had no intention of breaking her silence for anyone else, because he did not need to. He had already stepped inside it, already understood it in a way no one else had, and that made it something shared, something that no longer belonged entirely to her. And the realization sent a subtle but undeniable shift through her composure, because for the first time, her silence felt less like protection and more like something being held in place by someone else's awareness. And slowly, carefully, she turned the handle, opening the door just enough to step inside. The room beyond dimly lit, quiet, removed from everything outside, and she stepped forward without hesitation, because stopping now would not change anything, would not restore what had already shifted. And as she moved inside, she felt it again, that presence following, not pressing, not forcing, but certain, and the door closed behind them with a soft, final sound that echoed in the stillness. And Lydia stood there for a moment, her back to the door, her breath steady but no longer entirely controlled, because this was different from anything she had prepared for, different from anything she had survived before. And though she had spent 8 years building her silence into something unbreakable, she understood now, with a clarity that settled deep within her chest, that she was no longer the only one holding it together. The room held a different kind of silence, not the distant quiet of empty corridors or the controlled hush of the hall, but something closer, something contained, as if the walls themselves absorbed every sound and left only what could not be ignored. And Lydia remained where she stood for a moment, her back to the closed door, her breath steady but no longer effortless, because this space removed everything she had relied on to disappear. There were no shadows to blend into, no movement to hide within, no voices to distract from what remained. And what remained was him, his presence clear and unbroken, no longer diffused by distance or crowd. And she felt it fully now, not overwhelming, not forceful, but certain, like a steady weight that did not need to shift to be understood. And slowly, carefully, she turned, not abruptly, not defensively, but with the same measured control she had held on to since the beginning, because control was still hers, even if everything else had changed. And when she faced him, the distance between them was small, deliberate, leaving no room for avoidance. And for the first time since stepping into this space, she did not lower her gaze immediately, not completely, because something within her had shifted, something quiet but undeniable, and she held that moment, just for a second longer than before her eyes softened downward again, not in retreat, but in thought, because this was no longer about hiding what he already knew. It was about understanding what came after that knowledge. And the silence between them stretched, but it was no longer fragile. It was defined, shaped by everything that had already been revealed without needing to be spoken. And then he moved, not closer, not further, but enough to shift the space again. And when he spoke, his voice was quieter than before, but carried something deeper, something that no longer questioned. "You built it carefully," he said, and Lydia felt the words settle into her chest with a weight that was not unfamiliar. Because he was right. Every moment of those 8 years had been deliberate, every silence chosen, every reaction controlled, every part of her shaped to avoid exactly this. And yet here she was, standing in front of someone who had seen through it without needing her to break it apart. And for a moment, the instinct to retreat rose again, to return to what she knew, to reinforce the silence until it became impenetrable once more. But the thought did not hold the same certainty it once had, because something else had already entered that space, something she could not remove, and she felt it in the way her breath no longer felt entirely her own to command, in the way her thoughts did not immediately close off the path forward. And then he continued, the words, steady, deliberate, you chose it, and Lydia's fingers tightened slightly at her sides before she stilled them, because that truth landed differently. It was not something taken from her, not entirely. It was something she had shaped, held on to, even when it became part of who she was. And that realization did not weaken her control, it clarified it. And for the first time since stepping into this room, something shifted within her that did not feel like fear, something quieter, steadier, something that felt closer to understanding. And her lips parted before she could stop herself, the movement small, almost imperceptible. But this time, she did not close them immediately. She did not force the silence back into place out of instinct alone, because the moment had already changed. The rules she had followed no longer applied in the same way, and the quiet that followed felt different, not waiting, not pressing, but open. And then, softly, controlled but no longer absent, her voice returned, not loud, not trembling, but clear enough to exist. Yes. And the single word settled into the room with a quiet finality, not breaking the silence, but reshaping it. And Lydia felt it instantly, the shift within herself, not loss of control, but something else, something closer to reclaiming it in a way she had not expected. And when she lifted her gaze again, just slightly, enough to acknowledge without retreat, she did not feel the same need to disappear, because the silence was no longer the only thing defining her. And in the quiet that followed, his expression did not change, did not react in the way others might have. But there was something there, subtle, certain, as if the answer had confirmed something he already understood. And the moment held, steady and unbroken, before he spoke again, low and final. Then keep it, he said. And Lydia felt the meaning settle deeper than the words themselves, because it was not a command, not a demand. It was recognition, and something else, something that did not take her silence away, but acknowledged it as something that now existed between them, not hidden, not broken, but seen. And as the quiet settled once more, Lydia understood with a clarity that felt both unfamiliar and undeniable, that the silence she had used to survive had not been taken from her, it had been found, and somehow, that changed everything.